Chris is the author of 2 books, along with many other publications. I've followed his Prairie Ecologist blog for many years, and I know a lot of other people in this room have as well, and I continue to be inspired by his stories and photographs. Land stewardship is hard work and vastly underappreciated, so Chris is going to take time today to help us all remember why we're doing this work and why it matters. It's time to celebrate the work we have done for our nation's diverse ecosystems.
Okay, my turn. Oh, don't leave yet. This is going to be good. Hi, everybody. So my job is to make everybody feel better about land management. So I'm going to try that, but I'm going to start out by talking about challenges. So land management is hard, and there are all kinds of challenges that kind of stack on top of each other and continuously beat us down to the ground. And it can get really frustrating dealing with all those issues. But I think it's important to remember that, well, before I get into that, the other issue is that the public apathy is maybe the hardest of those, right? We do all this work, and we feel a lot of times like nobody really understands or cares about what we're doing, sometimes including our supervisors, if you're unlucky. And so there are people out there that just don't have any idea what we do, and it's hard to describe what we do because it's really varied, and people don't have the context to understand what it is we do. And so we try to talk about it anyway. And just as a quick aside, did you know that if you go into PowerPoint to make a presentation, and you go up under icons, you can pull out these things called cutout people, which are basically these little models that are posed in different ways, and you can make them say things and do things and dance around on screen for people. And you can have way more fun than you should while you're trying to build a presentation that you have to give 2 days from now. The other thing I was thinking about when I was doing this was that guy right there got paid some amount of money to be a cutout model for PowerPoint presentations, which is really cool. But I'm digressing. So the point of this all is that people don't understand what we do, and that's frustrating, right? And because they don't understand what we do, they don't really care about what we do. And I'm going to get back into that in a little bit. But really what I want to do today is I want to give you 3 reasons that we should keep doing what we're doing anyway, okay? So the first one is the places and the species and the communities we work with are incredible. We just saw a whole bunch of that from Minnesota's standpoint. I'm going to talk more about that. I want to talk about the fact that if you put our work in context, we're one generation within many, many generations of people who have been managing land and will continue to manage land for a long time. And I think putting it in that context is helpful. And then I want to talk at the end about the fact of, or the way that we can maybe get the public to back us more than they do now, by sharing the passion that we have for the work that we do. So let's start with the fun stuff, which is nature is amazing. So this is a bee with blue eyes that match the flower that it's on, which is the flower that it feeds on. It's the only flower that it feeds on. This is the blue sage bee, which feeds, as far as we know, exclusively on blue sage or pitcher sage, Salvia azurea. So it only comes out of the ground during the time of year when that flower blooms, because that's the only food source that it has for it and its babies. That's pretty amazing. I'm from Nebraska, where we have 12 million acres of the Nebraska Sandhills, which is contiguous prairie across, a big portion of the central part of the state. It's an amazing place. If you haven't been there, there's a lot of water, there's a lot of lakes and wetlands, as well as gorgeous plant communities. And at the very north edge of that is the Nature Conservancy's Niobrara Valley Preserve, which is one of the places I get to work. It's about 56,000 acres, plus 25 miles of riverfront. We have 2 big herds of bison, each of which have about 10 or 12,000 acres to run around on. There are prairie chickens, but also sharp-tailed grouse, like this one, which have at least 30 different leks across the property that we are managing, where they display, the males display for females. The Niobrara River is a national scenic river in that area, so we can kayak down both for fun and for work sometimes. Further south is the Platte River Prairies, which is where my home base is. It's where I started as a land manager about 25 years ago, and where I still have some advisory control over land management to some extent today. People come to see the sandhill cranes in the spring because about a 500,000 of them migrate through. And then we try to get them to come back in the summer when they can see the prairies that look something other than just brown. And then out in the Panhandle, I get to work in places like the Cherry Ranch, which is kind of more of a short grass prairie with rocky escarpments. And then I have my own family prairie, which is just a quarter section of land, but it's my favorite place in the world because it's the place that I get to know better than any other place on Earth. And in all of those places, there are these amazing organisms that we share the Earth with, like bobolinks, which look like little blackbirds with lobotomies, and who sing like R2-D2 as they fly around your head. Or upland sandpipers, which don't look like they belong, but look like they're shorebirds pretending to be meadowlarks. Or things like cliff swallows that make their houses out of mud that they carry in their mouths, one billful at a time, over and over and over until they build their houses. We don't think about how amazing that is often enough. Hognose snakes, one of the best actors in the animal world, right? So this is a hognose snake that is pretending to be really dangerous by flattening its head. When they do this, they'll inhale and exhale air in this huge hissing motion. How many people have seen that in person? Yeah, a lot of people have seen it in person. How many of your neighbors at home do you think have seen that in person? Hardly any, right? We have to tell them about that because they're really amazing. They look very dangerous, they're not. And if that doesn't scare you off, of course, then they play dead, right? So they flip over on their backs, they roil around for a while, and they wait until you think they're dead. And then eventually, they kind of just stare at you and say, okay, now go away, because I'm dead. This summer, I got to see the second spadefoot in my life, which is called a spadefoot toad. It's really more of a frog than a toad, but who cares? Well, people in this room care. Never mind, that's a bad thing to say. You care. But when I was photographing this spadefoot, I set it on an area of little loose dirt. It was an old pocket gopher mound. And over the next 3 minutes, it buried itself in the ground, just step by step, by just slowly moving its back feet in a circular pattern, which I had never gotten to see in person before, but I got to see it just slowly sink into the ground, which is just magical. But those are vertebrates, and they're fine. Invertebrates are what I tend to see most when I go out either with my camera or just now on my own, but I started seeing them with my camera. So this is an assassin bug with a fly that it caught. This summer I was taking pictures of frogs along the Niobrara River, and I noticed this white-tailed dragonfly laying eggs while her mate was flying above, defending her from others who would come by, and he would chase them off while she just kept tapping her tail on the water surface, laying eggs. And even other dragonflies of other species would come by and the male would chase them off. It was really cool, and it went on for a couple of minutes while I just laid there in the mud and watched enraptured. Did you know there's 108 grasshopper species in Nebraska? I don't know how many there are in Minnesota. I bet it's close. This is the lubber, the plains lubber, which is the size of a mouse with little tiny wings that don't do anything except look nice, I guess. This is another flightless grasshopper called the painted grasshopper or the barber pole grasshopper, which you might not think is camouflaged until you remember leopards, which are very well camouflaged even though they're orange and colorful but spotted. And then there's other kinds of camouflage, which I think grasshoppers are amazing in a lot of ways, but the camouflage is one of them. The stripes and the shape of the antenna on this grasshopper in the grass, or the cudweed grasshopper, which matches its favorite food almost perfectly in terms of not only color but texture, or the bandwing grasshoppers. There's lots of different bandwing grasshoppers which like bare ground, and they hide amazingly well in the bare ground until they fly. If you get too close to them, they fly, right? And they clack their wings, and they show these really colorful wings as they fly away from you, and you're so distracted by the noise and the color that you don't pay attention to where they land, and then you never find them again. And I want to talk about flies. How many species of flies can you name in your head right now? Go. Housefly, horsefly, deerfly, fruit fly? Very few of which are actual species, right? Those are groups. Is this a housefly? You don't know. I don't know. You don't know. It's not. There are 61,000 species of flies in North America. That's an estimate. because only about half to two-thirds of those have been described. 61,000 species of flies, and we could name, what, 4 or 5, most of us. This is not a housefly. This is a picture-wing fly that looks like it's wearing a gas mask. This is a great big old black horsefly that's more than an inch long. And this is a tiny little fly with a white abdomen that is much, much smaller. And here's an even smaller fly called the big-headed fly, which is funny because that's on Indian grass. If you know what Indian grass looks like, that gives you a scale for how small that little fly is. A lot of flies are pollinators, like these little fruit or hoverflies, or this hoverfly that looks like a bee, but of course it's not a bee because it only has 2 wings instead of 4, and its eyes are bigger and it has short antennae. You all knew that, right? There are tachinid flies, which are parasitoids. So they lay their eggs on other creatures, and their larvae crawl inside and eat them while they're still alive from the inside out, which is gross and cool at the same time, and also really important ecologically. There are things like bee flies, which have a stiff proboscis, and they can hover in front of a flower and stick that proboscis in there to get nectar and pollen. But also, speaking of going back to grasshoppers for a minute, they'll hover above a grasshopper as it's laying its eggs. So grasshoppers, when they lay their eggs, they stick their tail down into the soil, and they lay their eggs down there. And these bee flies will hover right above them, and they'll flick eggs so that they land next to where that grasshopper is. And then when those eggs hatch, the larvae crawl down into the hole where the grasshopper eggs are, and they eat the eggs and the larvae of the grasshoppers. That's really amazing. There are crane flies that look like mosquitoes, but aren't. And there are mosquitoes that are mosquitoes, but are also flies, because mosquitoes are in the Diptera order, so they're flies too. They count among that 61,000 species. There are things that look like they should not be predators, but are, like the long-legged fly, this little iridescent metallic green thing, which is gorgeous. And I didn't realize it was a predator until I saw one being a predator. Then I looked it up, and sure enough, they're predators. But if you want to talk about fly predators, we have to talk about robber flies, right? Robber flies are my absolute favorite fly. There's a lot of different kinds of them. They're amazing predators that are like surface-to-air missiles. They launch themselves off their perch or off the ground as soon as they see something out of the corner of their huge big eyes that flies up, and they'll intersect it in the air. They'll either catch it in the air or they'll knock it down out of the air. And so this one has a leafhopper in its mouth. This one caught another predator. This is a tiger beetle that I actually saw this happen. I was taking pictures of this robber fly, and I was taking pictures of the tiger beetle, sorry, and I almost got close enough to get the picture that I wanted, and then it flew up, and as soon as it flew up, that robber fly was on it and knocked it down, and I got to watch it feed for a little while. And then my daughter and I were out walking and heard the cicada, this great big old bush cicada, take off from behind us, but it was a very short flight, and it was shorter than it should have been. So we stopped and turned around and went back and looked, and sure enough, a robber fly had knocked it out of the air. And then some of them are just cheaters. I mean, this is a robber fly that doesn't look like a robber fly. That poor little beetle didn't have a chance because bumblebees are no threats to beetles, right? Bumblebees are just going around doing their own thing. We have to talk about plants, even though we just talked about plants for 45 minutes. But plants are also amazing. Plants can move, right? They have seed dispersal techniques that we could talk about for the next hour if we wanted to, that can help them move around the landscape at a very high risk, in a very high risk way, right? The vast majority of those seeds end up getting eaten or land in a place where they can't grow. They don't do any good for the plant. But a few of them do, and that's enough. And then they have other techniques of moving around that are more surefire but shorter distance, like rhizomes. And then they have buds, which from a perennial plant standpoint, they can essentially regenerate themselves forever. As long as they can bring enough energy to make enough buds to supply the next generation's worth of tillers and stems above ground, those plants can really live forever. And between buds and rhizomes and the clones of grasses and other plants that result from that, it's almost a sure thing that the longest lived plants in North America are not trees, but prairie plants. We just don't have any record to show that because they don't have tree rings that we can count. But I would bet lots of money that there are big blue stem clones much older than any of the trees we can find in the world. And then plants compete against each other in fun ways, right? You get all the traditional stuff, like they shade themselves out and they compete for root space. But then you have things like pussy toes that use chemical defenses to knock down their neighbors. You've got the hemiparasites. And you've got the full parasites like rope daughter that just, why even bother with chlorophyll? I'll just take my neighbor's food. And then I want to talk about milkweed just for a minute, because milkweed is a really good example of sort of semi-redundancy and resilience in the plant community. There are 17 species of milkweed in Nebraska. I assume it's similar in Minnesota. And all of them are really great pollen and nectar sources for pollinators, right? Regal fritillary butterflies or wasps or all kinds of things. If you don't know, by the way, if you don't know the pollination strategy for milkweeds, look it up. I was going to talk about it, and it was just, I take too long when I talk about it, so I'm not going to. But look it up. If you don't know anywhere else to look it up on my blog, of course, because I wrote a blog about it. Anyway, milkweeds provide food for all kinds of specialist herbivores that figure out how to deal with the toxic latex, whether that's longhorn beetles or these large milkweed bugs, which, by the way, are migratory. And then all these other species that have figured out a way to deal with that toxin, including, obviously, monarch butterflies, which is the way that the public knows about milkweed. And what I want to talk about is the reason that 17 species of milkweed is important in Nebraska. So in Nebraska, the monarch butterflies that we see each spring are the ones that they're the second generation out of Mexico. So the monarchs that leave us in Nebraska in the fall fly all the way down to Mexico, they overwinter in Mexico, and then they come back up into the southern U.S. and they lay eggs. When those eggs hatch, that's the generation that comes to Nebraska. They usually get there in May. In 2017, we got a bunch of butterflies in April that looked clearly like they had come all the way from Mexico. They looked like this picture. And there wasn't a lot to eat, so they ate a lot of dandelion nectar and pollen, or nectar, and a few other things that were out. And the bigger problem was that they were desperate to lay eggs. But the common and showy milkweed that they were ready to lay eggs on, their favorite plants to lay eggs on, had just been killed by a frost, or top killed by a frost, which happens in April. That's why monarchs probably don't typically migrate up until May. So there wasn't a lot of food available if you were only looking for showy and common milkweed. But fortunately, we have lots of different kinds of milkweed, and one of them, whorled milkweed, which is not typically a favorite of monarchs, but they'll use it, was not affected at all by the frost. So it was still nice and green and lush and vibrant, and so monarchs laid a whole bunch of eggs on whorled milkweed, including this egg and that little larva that hatched in the back, which, by the way, has a little parasitoid egg on top of it. So we're not only supporting monarchs, but we're also supporting parasitoids, which deserve to be supported. And we'd raised an entire generation of monarchs in Nebraska in April, when we really shouldn't have, because we had lots of species of milkweed, some of which are not prone to frost. That's a really cool little anecdotal story that talks about why plant diversity matters. And so then we had happy monarchs by the end of the summer. And I want to end the invertebrate portion with my favorite invertebrate in the entire world, and many of you are going to know this story if you read my blog. But the camouflage looper, this tiny little inchworm, which is smaller than an inchworm, decorates itself, camouflages itself with bits of the flower that it eats, right? So here's one that's been feeding on purple prairie clover, and every few bites it just grabs a little bit of flour and it sticks it to its back. Here's one that's feeding on black-eyed Susan and doing the same thing. And then eventually it turns into this moth, which is fine. It's the wavy line emerald. It's okay. It's not the main point of the story. Last summer, I was out and found this camouflage looper on a sunflower at the Niobrara Valley Preserve. And after I photographed it for a while, I took the flower and the caterpillar back to the headquarters because I wanted other people to be able to see it. And here's a picture of it eating a little piece of flour like an ice cream cone because it's really cute. And what I did is I put the flower and the caterpillar in a jar, and I put another flower, the hoary vervain, in there because it was a different color. I wanted to see if the caterpillar would change its costume overnight. And I put a little paper towel underneath it so that if it fell off the flower, it wouldn't fall into the water, and then I put a glass over the top. Okay, homemade terrarium, it's real easy. And I went to bed, got up the next morning, and I went to check to see if it had changed its costume, because I was really excited to see if it would do that. And it had changed its costume, but not in the way that I expected. This is why the camouflage looper is my favorite insect in the world. Okay. So that's the fun stuff. The rest of it is okay too. I want to in terms of being frustrated or being pessimistic about our work, I think the important thing to remember is that we are one generation. We are one link in this very long chain of land stewardship. People have been managing land on the earth for many thousands of years, depending on what paper you read, 12,000, 13,000, 20,000 years. we're just one little piece of that, right? When I talk about restoration with people, ecological restoration, I use this analogy, this metaphor, that we're not trying to do the kind of restoration that we do when we create old buildings again, right? Or restore old cars, where there's a defined endpoint. We want to use the exact same materials. We want it to look exactly like it used to and work exactly like it used to. That's not the objective for ecological restoration. Normally, what we're doing is more like restoring a city after a disaster, right? The key points here are we want to get the services up and running again. We want housing, food, transportation, communication, law enforcement, all these things to be up and running again. Whether it looks exactly like it did before is a lot less important, because the point is for the community members to be able to survive and thrive. So that final product is flexible, it's the function that matters. I think that's the way to think about ecological restoration, right? Rather than trying to define this solid static endpoint. So I think we can take that analogy then, we can push that forward into stewardship, so beyond restoration, but more of a management standpoint. It's the same idea. Reed Noss is taking notes on this, by the way, so you know it's important. So even when we're doing land stewardship, it's the continuation of those services, housing, food, transportation, communication, right? And then we can facilitate adaptation to make sure that those services continue no matter what's happening around us. We help the community evolve. And there isn't an endpoint, and that's the key. That right there is the key. There isn't an endpoint. Our job is not to fix the natural world. Our job is to keep it operational, because there are people coming after us that'll take over when we're done. So whatever site you're working on, your job is not to fix all the problems at that site. Your job is to make sure that site is still there for the next people to come and manage it. I think for me at least, that's a much easier thing to digest when I think about the overwhelming catastrophes going on around us. What we need to do is we need to facilitate resilience. We need to help take advantage of the 61,000 species of flies that are out there and the 17 species of milkweeds in Nebraska, and give those communities and those assemblages of species a chance to do what they're really good at, which is to be resilient. Some of them are good at some things, some of them are good at other things. If you have them all there, there's always going to be things that'll happen, right? So then the last challenge is how to get the public behind us. Because all of us would like to think that the people around us think like we do, and they like nature the way that we do. That's not the case, right? A large number of the public not only is sort of neutral to nature or ignores nature, but is afraid of nature. So we have a lot of people that we need to be behind us who are afraid of box elder bugs on their windowsill, right? And that's a serious concern. I've dealt with it myself. We had people that came with a busload of high school girls to spend the night at one of our places, and they turned around and left because there were box elder bugs in the house. That's a really sad event. But it tells us that there are a lot of people out there who don't understand nature and are afraid of nature, and we need to reach those people. One approach that we tend to take is to try to hit them over the head with facts, right? We talk about why you need to support nature for your own good. How many conversations have you ever started with somebody with you when you use that tone, you need to do this for your own good, and then it comes out well in the end? It hardly ever works, right? That's not how you start a conversation. You start a conversation by identifying common themes and getting to know people and sharing common things that you have in common. And more importantly, you tell stories. You talk about what you're interested in, what you're into. So the people in this room, we're inspired by things like this, right? Talk about that. Just talk about why you care about what you care about. What is interesting about the world that you are managing, that you're working to conserve? And if you talk about that with passion, people will listen. Even if they don't understand what you're talking about, they'll come to your passion and they'll stay and they'll listen. And then talk about the work that you do. Don't just talk about the species and the cool things, although you should do that, but talk about what you do, why you do it, how you do it, because people are really interested. The most mundane thing in your week will still be interesting to people who aren't in this field because it's different from what they know. And if you can explain what you're doing and why you're doing it and why it matters, people will listen. Even this guy. Yeah. So you might say, well, I have so many things to do. Why do I have to do that also? Because the problem is, who else is going to do it if you don't? We're the ones that have the passion. We're the ones that know what we're talking about. We're the ones that are out there seeing it every day. Who else is going to tell the stories if we don't do it? I'm an introvert. Doing this is fine because I'm in control of the situation, right? Writing a blog is fine. I'm in control of the situation. You put me in a cocktail party and I go to the bathroom and I'll stay there all night. I don't like small talk very much, except with people like you. But I find ways to tell the stories that are comfortable for me. You don't have to do it the same way I do it, right? You don't have to be a nature photographer. You don't have to be a writer. You could go bowling with a bunch of friends and talk about the work that you do, and that'll be helpful. You can post on Facebook or social media of any kind that you're comfortable with. That'll be helpful. Tell your story in whatever way is comfortable for you, but tell it with passion and it'll work. So most importantly, keep your head up. We can do this. We are doing this. We have been doing this, and we will be doing this. The places that we're working on, the species we're working with are incredible. They're amazing. We're just one link. We're one generation in this long chain, which I think is a helpful context. And we can get the public behind us if we work on it, okay? You have to tell your story, even if it's uncomfortable. And then if you do that, we'll be fine. Thank you.